The history of London can be traced back to its founding as the Roman settlement of Londinium around AD 43. The Romans, led by Emperor Claudius, established Londinium on the banks of the River Thames during their conquest of Britain. This was not an isolated settlement, but a carefully planned and strategically important location. The Romans chose this site because the River Thames provided a natural trade route, enabling the city to flourish as a trading hub connecting the Roman Empire to the rest of Europe. Its proximity to the river allowed for the easy movement of goods, which attracted merchants and traders from various parts of the empire. At the time of its foundation, Londinium was a modest settlement, likely only a few thousand inhabitants. It was originally a military base, but quickly grew in importance as the Romans established administrative control over Britain. The city's layout was based on the typical Roman style, with wide streets, a forum, and a grid-like street pattern that set it apart from the more haphazard settlements of the local Celtic tribes. The Roman presence marked the beginning of London's long history of urban development, and its strategic position helped it become a significant commercial center within the Roman Empire. By the 2nd century AD, Londinium had grown into a thriving town, complete with a bustling port, public baths, temples, and even an amphitheater. It was the largest city in Britain, with a population reaching up to 50,000 people at its peak. The Romans built walls around Londinium to protect it from potential invasions, and remnants of these walls can still be seen in parts of the modern city today. The establishment of Londinium laid the groundwork for London's future as a center of commerce, culture, and political power. Throughout the Roman occupation, Londinium also served as an important administrative capital of Roman Britain. Roman law, governance, and military strategies shaped much of the city's early development. The British tribes, who had lived in the area for centuries before the Romans arrived, were slowly integrated into the Roman system, with many of them taking part in the bustling trade networks and the new infrastructure that was rapidly being developed. However, the Roman influence did not last forever. In the early 5th century, as the Roman Empire began to decline, the Romans withdrew from Britain, leaving Londinium and other settlements vulnerable to invasions. By the time the Romans departed, Londinium had already laid the foundation for the future growth of London, with its city walls, infrastructure, and cultural heritage leaving an indelible mark on the city that would continue to influence its development for centuries to come. The Roman era in London is often seen as the beginning of the city's transformation into a major urban center. It introduced many aspects of urban living that would later become synonymous with the city, including the development of roads, public baths, and trade networks. Londinium's legacy would continue to echo throughout London's long and storied history. The influence of Roman engineering, culture, and governance helped shape the city into the complex and dynamic metropolis we recognize today. Following the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the Anglo-Saxons took control, but London's strategic position made it a target for invaders. One of the most significant waves of invasion came from the Vikings, who began raiding England's coasts in the late 8th century. These Norse seafarers, often referred to as the Danes or Norsemen, conducted swift raids along the British shores, and by the mid-9th century, they had turned their attention to London. In 851 AD, the Vikings first attacked London, but it was not until the mid-9th century that they established a stronghold in the city. In 866, the Viking leader Ivar the Boneless, a son of the famous Viking king Ragnar Lodbrok, led a large army into East Anglia and then pushed southward into Wessex. The Vikings began to exert control over much of the north and east of England, including London, which at the time was a relatively small Anglo-Saxon town. The Viking invasions forced Londoners to adapt and fortify their defenses. The city's original Roman walls, though aging, were reinforced to help protect it from Viking raids. The Vikings, who had a reputation for fierce battles and devastating pillaging, took advantage of the division within Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to secure control over large swaths of land. London was caught in the middle of this conflict between Anglo-Saxons and Vikings. In 878 AD, King Alfred the Great of Wessex, one of the most famous Anglo-Saxon kings, launched a counteroffensive against the Viking invaders. Alfred's military genius and his ability to unite the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in the face of Viking threats played a critical role in halting the Viking expansion into southern England. However, the Vikings didn't give up on London so easily. For much of the 9th and 10th centuries, London alternated between being controlled by the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, with power shifting back and forth. By the early 10th century, the Vikings, under the leadership of King Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark and his son, King Knut, began to exert more control over England. Knut's rule, which lasted from 1016 to 1035, marked a period of consolidation for the Viking influence in London and the rest of England. Under his reign, London became an important administrative center in the Viking kingdom, and many of the Anglo-Saxon traditions and governance systems were integrated with Viking rule. The Vikings brought significant changes to the social and economic landscape of London. One of the most important legacies of the Viking era was the city's transformation into a major trading hub. The Viking seafaring culture facilitated trade across the North Sea, connecting London with Scandinavia, the Baltic region, and beyond. This expanded trade network helped London's economy grow, despite the violent history of the period. Viking influence can still be seen in London today. Many of the Viking names of places, particularly in the East End, remain in use. The city's Old Norse heritage is also reflected in the language, with several words of Viking origin becoming part of the English language. The Viking invasions were instrumental in shaping London's development, marking a pivotal chapter in the city's history. Despite the destruction and turmoil they brought, the Vikings left a lasting imprint on London's cultural and economic evolution. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 stands as one of the most pivotal moments in British history, and its effects on London were profound. In the early 11th century, England was under the rule of the Anglo-Saxon king, Edward the Confessor, whose death without a direct heir led to a contentious succession dispute. Harold Godwin's son, an Anglo-Saxon noble, was crowned king, but his claim to the throne was challenged by several contenders, most notably William, Duke of Normandy. William, also known as William the Conqueror, had been promised the throne by Edward the Confessor, and he had a legitimate claim. However, Harold was crowned king instead, sparking the famous conflict that would lead to the Norman invasion. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Hastings on October 14, 1066, when William's forces defeated Harold's army, effectively ending Anglo-Saxon rule in England. Following his victory, William advanced toward London to solidify his control over the kingdom. The people of London, however, were reluctant to accept a foreign ruler, and the city initially resisted William's attempts to take it. Nonetheless, after a brief siege, the citizens of London surrendered to William in December 1066, and he was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey on Christmas Day of the same year. The Norman conquest fundamentally changed the social, political, and architectural landscape of London. William's victory marked the beginning of Norman rule, which would alter not only the city but the entire country. One of the first acts of the new Norman king was to establish his authority over the capital by constructing a powerful symbol of his control, the Tower of London. This formidable fortress, originally built as a royal residence and military stronghold, was designed to intimidate and control the population of London, sending a clear message that Norman authority had firmly taken root. The Tower of London became a focal point for the Norman regime, and it would continue to play an important role throughout British history. In addition to the Tower of London, the Normans implemented significant administrative and legal reforms throughout England, which were reflected in the changes they brought to London. The Anglo-Saxon system of governance was replaced with the feudal system, in which land and power were granted to Norman lords in exchange for military service. This system further centralized power in the hands of the monarchy, and it had lasting effects on London's political structure. The Normans also introduced a new social order, which altered the balance of power between the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the incoming Norman elites. Another profound effect of the Norman conquest on London was the change in architecture. The Normans brought with them advanced building techniques and a distinct style, particularly in the construction of churches and castles. This is evident in the Romanesque style of architecture that became prevalent in London after the conquest. Many of the churches and buildings in London were either rebuilt or newly constructed in this style, including Westminster Abbey, which was rebuilt by the Normans under the patronage of William the Conqueror. The Domesday Book, compiled in 1086, is another legacy of the Norman conquest and offers crucial insight into the state of London and the rest of England at the time. Commissioned by William to assess the resources and landholdings across his new kingdom, the Domesday Book is the most comprehensive survey of medieval England. It records the ownership of land, the number of inhabitants, and the agricultural productivity of various regions, including London. This document not only reflected the strength of Norman rule, but also laid the groundwork for the future development of the English economy, including the urban growth of London. The Norman conquest also had long-term social implications. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, which had previously controlled much of the land and power in London, was displaced by the Normans, who replaced them with their own supporters. This shift in the power structure caused significant resentment among the Anglo-Saxon population, leading to occasional uprisings and challenges to Norman rule. Despite these challenges, the Normans eventually consolidated their power, and London became the center of the English monarchy and a key city in the burgeoning medieval kingdom. In the centuries that followed, the impact of the Norman conquest would continue to be felt. The feudal system remained entrenched in England for much of the medieval period, and the Norman influence on language, culture, and governance helped shape the identity of medieval England. London, as the political and cultural heart of the country, became a symbol of Norman dominance, and its role as the center of royal authority was solidified during this period. The legacy of the Norman conquest is woven deeply into the fabric of London's history, influencing its development and its place in the broader story of England's evolution. The Black Death, one of the deadliest pandemics in human history, struck London in 1348, causing widespread death and devastation across Europe. The disease, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, is believed to have spread to London through trade routes, possibly brought in by ships coming from the Mediterranean. The rapid spread of the plague had a profound impact on the city, leaving it ravaged and its population decimated. It is estimated that between 1/3 and 1/2 of London's population perished during the 2-year span of the outbreak. London in the 14th century was a densely populated urban center, with cramped living conditions, a lack of sanitation, and an extensive trade network that connected it to various regions of Europe and beyond. These factors made it particularly susceptible to the rapid spread of the plague. The disease is thought to have been carried by fleas that infested rats, and once the fleas bit humans, they transmitted the bacteria, leading to the characteristic symptoms of the Black Death: fever, chills, swollen lymph nodes, and painful boils. As the epidemic progressed, the city saw an overwhelming number of people fall ill, and many who contracted the disease died within days. The effects of the Black Death were catastrophic, not only in terms of the loss of life, but also in the social and economic fabric of London. The city was forced to confront the reality of mass death, as public health measures such as quarantine and the burial of the dead in mass graves became commonplace. The fear and devastation caused by the plague led to a breakdown in normal social order. Trade came to a halt, and many businesses closed, as there was not enough labor to maintain the city's economy. Markets and shops were abandoned, and the city's population, already significantly reduced by the disease, struggled to function. The plague also brought about a major shift in labor dynamics. With so many workers dead, there was a severe shortage of laborers, and the surviving population began to demand higher wages. This created tension between the workers and the landowners, who sought to keep wages low. The economic disruption caused by the Black Death led to rising inflation, as the demand for goods and services increased while the supply of labor decreased. For many people, this period of social upheaval also led to significant changes in their relationships with authority and the established systems of power. In the wake of the plague, the city of London began to rebuild itself, though it would take many years for the population to recover. The crisis led to significant changes in the structure of society. One of the most important long-term effects of the Black Death was the shift in the balance of power between the upper classes and the laboring population. With fewer workers available, wages began to rise, and the labor force, particularly in agriculture and craftsmanship, gained more bargaining power. This change in economic dynamics would help lay the foundation for social movements and rebellions in the centuries to come. The Black Death also had cultural and religious consequences. As the epidemic spread, the Church's inability to prevent or cure the disease led to a loss of faith among many people. Some began to question the authority of the Church, and this skepticism would later contribute to movements like the Protestant Reformation. Additionally, the mass deaths led to a change in attitudes toward death itself, with many people becoming preoccupied with themes of mortality. Art, literature, and religious practices began to reflect a society deeply marked by the tragedy of the plague. London's recovery from the Black Death was a slow and painful process. The population gradually rebounded over the next few decades, but the scars left by the plague were deep. The social, economic, and cultural shifts that occurred during and after the Black Death would shape the city for generations to come. The events of 1348 to 1350 were not merely a moment of crisis. They were a turning point in the history of London, one that would influence the city's growth and development in profound ways. The Black Death serves as a stark reminder of how a single event can transform a society, leaving its mark on both the physical and social landscape. The Great Fire of London, which occurred in September 1666, is one of the most infamous events in the city's history. The fire, which started in a small bakery on Pudding Lane, quickly spread across the tightly packed streets of medieval London, engulfing much of the city in flames. Over the course of 4 days, the fire destroyed approximately 87 churches, 13,000 houses, and dozens of public buildings, leaving a large portion of the city in ruins. The destruction was so widespread that it changed the landscape of London permanently, affecting everything from the city's architecture to its social and economic structure. The fire began on the night of September 2nd, 1666, in the house of Thomas Farriner, the king's baker. A spark from his oven is believed to have ignited the building, and due to the dry weather, strong winds, and the wooden nature of most of the buildings in the area, the fire spread rapidly. By the morning of September 3rd, the fire had grown into an uncontrollable blaze. The city's narrow, winding streets, combined with buildings made primarily of timber, provided ample fuel for the flames. The fire spread quickly from one house to the next, and despite the efforts of the city's firefighting brigades, it was impossible to halt its progress. One of the challenges in fighting the fire was the lack of organized firefighting infrastructure in London at the time. The city had primitive firefighting equipment, such as handheld pumps and buckets of water, but these were ineffective against the scale of the blaze. Additionally, the densely packed wooden buildings made it nearly impossible for the fire to be contained. As the fire spread, many of the city's residents attempted to save their belongings, but with little success. Thousands of people were forced to flee their homes, and many were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. In the aftermath of the fire, the scale of the destruction became evident. The heart of London, including important landmarks such as St. Paul's Cathedral, the Royal Exchange, and the homes of prominent citizens, had been reduced to ash. The fire also devastated many businesses, and the economy of London was severely impacted. It is estimated that around 70,000 people were left homeless as a result of the fire, and the loss of life, although minimal considering the scale of the disaster, was still significant. The aftermath of the Great Fire prompted a massive rebuilding effort. King Charles II, who was in power at the time, took an active role in the reconstruction of the city. The architect Sir Christopher Wren was commissioned to redesign many of London's buildings, including St. Paul's Cathedral, which would become one of the most iconic landmarks in the city. Wren's design for St. Paul's, with its grand dome, was a symbol of resilience and rebirth after the devastation caused by the fire. The rebuilding of the city also brought about significant changes in urban planning. The streets of London were widened, and new building regulations were put in place to prevent such a disaster from happening again. Buildings were now required to be made of brick or stone, replacing the wooden structures that had fueled the fire. Beyond the physical rebuilding of the city, the Great Fire also had social and cultural implications. The disaster forced Londoners to reconsider their relationship with urban living. The fire exposed the city's vulnerability, especially given its cramped and haphazard urban design. In its wake, there was a growing sense of urgency to improve fire safety and public health. The fire also had a psychological impact on Londoners, many of whom were traumatized by the sheer scale of the destruction. The fire became a symbol of both catastrophe and renewal, and in the years that followed, it influenced the city's architectural, political, and social development. The Great Fire of London also led to a more centralized and organized approach to governing the city. The fire revealed how ill-prepared London was for such a large-scale disaster, and it prompted the creation of better emergency response systems. The role of the Lord Mayor and other civic authorities in responding to the fire became a subject of debate, and as a result, the city's leadership structure was reformed to ensure more effective management of future crises. The rebuilding of London after the Great Fire was a monumental task that took many years to complete, but it ultimately set the stage for the city's transformation into a modern metropolis. The fire marked the end of an era of medieval urban planning and the beginning of a new phase in the city's development, characterized by wider streets, more resilient buildings, and more sophisticated governance. While the devastation of the Great Fire of London was a tragic event, it also provided an opportunity for the city to reinvent itself, laying the foundation for the vibrant, resilient capital that London would become in the centuries to follow. The Industrial Revolution, which began in the late 18th century and continued into the 19th century, had a profound and transformative effect on London, fundamentally altering its economy, society, and landscape. As the heart of the British Empire and one of the world's most important commercial centers, London was at the forefront of this period of rapid industrialization. The revolution brought with it new technologies, manufacturing processes, and an explosion in population, all of which reshaped the city in ways that still influence its development today. The roots of the Industrial Revolution in London can be traced to the rise of mechanized industries and the expansion of the manufacturing sector. Prior to this period, much of London's economy was based on trade, finance, and crafts. However, the introduction of new technologies, such as steam power and the mechanization of textile manufacturing, allowed for a shift from traditional artisanal methods of production to large-scale industrial factories. This shift resulted in the growth of new industries in and around London, including textiles, ironworks, and machinery production. London's central location and its existing infrastructure made it an ideal place for these industries to flourish. The construction of canals and railways played a crucial role in the industrialization of London. The introduction of the canal system in the early 19th century allowed goods to be transported more efficiently, linking London to other parts of the country. The opening of the first London Underground line in 1863, the world's first subway system, revolutionized transportation within the city. Railways and the Underground not only facilitated the movement of goods, but also allowed workers to live further from their places of employment, contributing to the expansion of the city's population and the development of new suburban areas. As the demand for labor grew with the rise of industrial factories, London experienced a population boom. By the early 19th century, the city's population had swelled to over 1 million, making it one of the largest cities in the world. The influx of people, both from rural areas and from abroad, led to rapid urbanization. However, this growth came with significant challenges. The city's infrastructure, which had been built for a much smaller population, struggled to keep pace with the influx of people. Overcrowding became a major issue, with many working-class families living in cramped, unsanitary conditions in the East End and other industrial neighborhoods. The lack of adequate housing, sanitation, and public health services led to widespread poverty and disease. The Industrial Revolution also led to significant changes in the social structure of London. The traditional class system began to evolve as a new industrial middle class emerged. This group, which consisted of factory owners, merchants, and professionals, gained wealth and influence, and their growing power began to reshape London's political landscape. At the same time, the working class, composed of factory workers, laborers, and immigrants, faced difficult working conditions, long hours, and low wages. This disparity between the rich and the poor became more pronounced as industrialization progressed, leading to tensions and social unrest. The working conditions in factories and other industries were often harsh and dangerous. Child labor was widespread, with children as young as 5 or 6 working in factories, coal mines, and mills. These children were subjected to long hours, unsafe working environments, and little pay. The Industrial Revolution also saw the rise of organized labor movements as workers began to demand better wages, improved working conditions, and the right to form trade unions. The labor unrest and protests that took place in London during this time were part of a broader global movement for workers' rights, and they ultimately led to significant social reforms, such as the Factory Acts, which sought to regulate child labor and improve conditions for factory workers. Despite these challenges, the Industrial Revolution also brought about significant advances in science, medicine, and technology that improved the quality of life for many Londoners. New innovations in medicine, such as vaccinations and improved public health practices, helped reduce the spread of disease. The advent of public sanitation systems, including the construction of sewers and clean water supply systems, began to address the unsanitary conditions in the city. Additionally, technological advances in transportation, such as the development of steamships and railroads, made it easier for people and goods to move in and out of London, further integrating the city into the global economy. London also became a cultural and intellectual hub during the Industrial Revolution. The city saw the rise of new forms of entertainment, such as theaters, museums, and art galleries, as well as the growth of intellectual movements like the Enlightenment and the rise of social reformers. Writers such as Charles Dickens, who chronicled the lives of the poor in his novels, played an important role in bringing attention to the social issues that arose during this period. Dickens' works, including Oliver Twist and Hard Times, highlighted the stark contrast between the wealthy industrialists and the suffering working class, drawing attention to the need for social and economic reforms. The industrialization of London led to the expansion of its global influence. As the world's leading financial center, London became the heart of the British Empire, which at its height controlled vast territories across Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The city's ports and warehouses facilitated the exchange of goods from all over the world, making London a key player in the global economy. The wealth generated by trade and industry allowed London to become a city of immense prosperity, but it also exposed deep inequalities, as the benefits of this prosperity were not shared equally among all its residents. The legacy of the Industrial Revolution in London is still evident today. The city's architectural landscape was transformed as factories, warehouses, and bridges were built to accommodate the growing industrial economy. Many of these structures, some of which still stand today, are reminders of London's industrial past. The development of transportation infrastructure during this time laid the foundation for the city's modern transport system, which continues to serve millions of Londoners every day. The social and political changes that occurred during the Industrial Revolution helped shape the modern welfare state, with a push for workers' rights and social justice influencing government policies for generations. In conclusion, the Industrial Revolution was a defining period in the history of London. It brought about profound changes in the city's economy, society, and infrastructure. While it led to significant advances in technology, medicine, and culture, it also highlighted the challenges of industrialization, including poverty, inequality, and harsh working conditions. The legacy of this period continues to shape London, making it a city that is both a symbol of innovation and progress and a reminder of the social struggles that accompanied the rise of industry. The 19th century was a period of tremendous transformation for London, as it became a symbol of Victorian Britain, an era marked by industrialization, urban expansion, and profound social change. The reign of Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901, was not only a time of imperial power and wealth, but also a time of deep social and economic inequality, class division, and radical reform. Victorian London witnessed the city's development into one of the most important urban centers in the world, as it became the heart of the British Empire and a symbol of progress and innovation, even as it grappled with the challenges of modernization. During the Victorian period, London experienced an unprecedented population explosion. The city's population grew from about 2 million in 1800 to over 6 million by the end of the 19th century. This growth was driven by rural migration, immigration from other parts of the British Empire, and the increasing availability of jobs in the city's burgeoning industries. This population boom led to rapid urbanization, with new neighborhoods, districts, and suburbs springing up to accommodate the influx of people. However, as London expanded, so did the problems associated with overcrowding, inadequate housing, and lack of infrastructure. Much of Victorian London's growth was driven by the success of the Industrial Revolution. Factories, railways, and ports proliferated throughout the city, and London became the industrial and financial powerhouse of the British Empire. The city was home to vast manufacturing complexes, including textile mills, printing presses, and ironworks, which produced goods for both domestic consumption and export to colonies around the world. The economic boom associated with industrialization made London one of the wealthiest cities on earth. Yet this prosperity was not shared equally, and poverty was rampant among the working classes, who often lived in squalid conditions. The Victorian era saw the rise of a new social class system, with the middle and upper classes benefiting greatly from the industrial economy, while the working classes faced difficult and often dehumanizing conditions. The East End of London, in particular, became infamous for its overcrowded slums, where many of the city's poor lived in deplorable conditions. In these areas, sanitation was minimal, housing was inadequate, and disease spread rapidly due to the lack of clean water and waste management. Poverty-stricken families often lived in cramped, multi-story houses, sharing a single room or living in buildings where several families were crammed together. This situation contributed to a series of social problems, including high mortality rates and the spread of infectious diseases like cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis. Despite the stark contrast between the wealthy and the poor, the Victorian period also saw significant social reform, driven by the growing awareness of the plight of the working class. Figures like Charles Dickens, whose novels such as Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and Bleak House depicted the harsh realities of life in Victorian London, raised public awareness about the dire conditions in the city's slums. The Victorian era also witnessed the rise of philanthropic movements, with wealthy individuals and organizations working to improve the living conditions of the poor. This era saw the development of public health reforms, including the creation of public sanitation systems and the improvement of housing in the city. The establishment of charitable organizations and reforms in education also aimed to address the social challenges faced by the working classes. The Victorian period also saw the emergence of London's iconic institutions, which have since become an integral part of the city's identity. The British Museum, the National Gallery, and the Victoria and Albert Museum were all established during this time, making London a center of culture, knowledge, and intellectual exchange. This was also the era when the London Underground, the world's first subway system, was created, revolutionizing transportation and making it easier for people to travel across the growing city. The expansion of the railway system, both within the city and connecting London to other parts of the country, played a critical role in transforming the city into a modern metropolis. One of the most notable aspects of Victorian London was its role as the heart of the British Empire. As the capital of the largest empire in history, London was a focal point of imperial politics, culture, and commerce. The wealth generated by the British Empire, through trade, colonization, and exploitation of resources, helped sustain the city's growth. The Victorian era was a time of British imperial pride, and London's landmarks and institutions reflected the empire's global influence. The city became home to a variety of colonial exhibits, including the Great Exhibition of 1851, which showcased the achievements of British industry and imperialism. London was also the site of monumental architecture, including the construction of the Houses of Parliament, Buckingham Palace, and the Tower Bridge, which symbolized the strength and grandeur of the British Empire. However, Victorian London was also the site of social tension and unrest. The growing divide between the wealthy elite and the impoverished working class sparked demands for political change. The rise of trade unions, the push for better labor rights, and movements for universal suffrage and political participation were critical in shaping the political landscape of the time. The Victorian era saw significant strides in the rights of women, workers, and the poor. Reformers like Florence Nightingale, who pioneered modern nursing, and social activists like Josephine Butler, who campaigned for women's rights, were instrumental in pushing for progressive changes in society. The period also saw the emergence of the suffragette movement, which began to gain traction toward the end of the century, calling for women's right to vote. One of the most notorious and mysterious aspects of Victorian London was its reputation for crime and vice. The city became infamous for the spread of criminal activity, including the notorious cases of Jack the Ripper, whose unsolved murders in 1888 captured the imagination of both the public and the media. The darker side of Victorian London, with its criminal underworld and the social problems associated with poverty, became a key feature of the city's identity during this period. The rise of police forces, such as the Metropolitan Police, established in 1829 under Sir Robert Peel, was part of the broader effort to curb crime and maintain order in the city. In the cultural sphere, the Victorian period was marked by the flourishing of literature, art, and theater. London became the birthplace of some of the world's most celebrated authors, including Charles Dickens, George Eliot, and Thomas Hardy. The city also saw the rise of new forms of entertainment, such as music halls and theaters, which became a popular way for Londoners to escape the hardships of daily life. The arts flourished during this time, with the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, a group of artists who sought to challenge the conventions of the art world, gaining prominence in London's cultural scene. The legacy of Victorian London is still evident today. The city's transformation into a global metropolis, with its impressive architecture, cultural institutions, and vast social changes, laid the foundation for the modern city we know today. The rise of industrial capitalism, the growth of the middle class, the struggles of the working class, and the legacy of British imperialism all shaped London's evolution during the Victorian period. The social, cultural, and political developments of this era continue to influence London's identity, making it a city that is both a product of its history and a place that continues to evolve in the 21st century. The period of World War I and the interwar years was a defining era in the history of London, marked by great hardship, social upheaval, and the eventual emergence of new political and cultural dynamics. As the capital of the United Kingdom, London played a crucial role during World War I, both as the center of government and as a target of enemy attacks. The city endured significant challenges during the war, and the social fabric was severely tested. The aftermath of the war and the following interwar period also brought about significant changes in London's economy, culture, and society, as the city struggled to adapt to a post-war world. When World War I broke out in 1914, London was at the heart of the British Empire's war effort. The city became a hub of military strategy, industry, and propaganda, as the government sought to mobilize resources for the war. The city was also home to the military headquarters, where key decisions were made about the British military's involvement in Europe. London's economy, which had been bolstered by the Industrial Revolution, shifted dramatically during the war. Factories and industries were repurposed to produce weapons, munitions, and supplies for the war effort, leading to a significant increase in production and the employment of women in roles traditionally held by men. London, like many other cities across Europe, was not immune to the devastating effects of war. One of the most visible impacts on the city was the bombing campaign carried out by the German Air Force. The city was subjected to bombing raids, particularly the Zeppelin raids, which targeted London in 1915 and 1916, followed by the more intense air raids by the German Luftwaffe in 1917. These attacks caused significant destruction, with many civilian buildings, homes, and landmarks damaged or destroyed. The London skyline, which had previously been dominated by its iconic churches and monuments, was scarred by the presence of bombed-out buildings and wreckage. Despite the destruction, Londoners showed remarkable resilience, and the sense of solidarity and collective effort during the war became a hallmark of the city's character. During the war, the city's population also experienced significant social shifts. With so many men enlisted in the military, women played an increasingly important role in both the workforce and the home front. Women worked in factories, munitions plants, and offices, performing jobs that had been previously reserved for men. This shift in gender roles marked a significant change in British society, and women's increased participation in the workforce laid the groundwork for the women's suffrage movement, which gained momentum during the war. Women's contributions during the conflict were one of the driving factors behind the eventual granting of the right to vote to women in 1918. London played a central role in this political and social change, with many suffragists and suffragettes using the city as a platform to campaign for equal rights. The economic impact of World War I was devastating. While industrial production surged during the war, the immediate post-war period saw widespread economic hardship. The British economy, which had been heavily reliant on the war effort, was deeply strained by the costs of the war. The aftermath of the war left London struggling with unemployment, inflation, and a general sense of economic uncertainty. Many former soldiers returned home to find few job opportunities, and the city experienced widespread poverty, particularly in the poorer neighborhoods of the East End. At the same time, the financial district in the City of London struggled to regain its pre-war dominance, as the global economy was reshaped by the war and the rise of new economic powers. The interwar years were a period of significant political and social change for London. The rise of the Labour Party, which emerged as a powerful political force in the wake of the war, brought about a shift in the political landscape. The Labour Party began to represent the working class, and its growing influence was a response to the economic and social conditions that had been exacerbated by the war. The 1920s and 1930s also saw the rise of new political movements, including the increasing popularity of socialism and communism, as well as the far-right and fascist movements. London, as the heart of the British political establishment, became a battleground for these competing ideologies, and political demonstrations and protests became a regular feature of the city's streets. The interwar period also saw significant cultural developments in London. The city, like the rest of the world, was deeply affected by the cultural changes of the 1920s, including the influence of jazz, Art Deco, and modernist movements. London's artistic and literary scene flourished during this time, with writers, musicians, and artists flocking to the city to make their mark on the world. The Bloomsbury Group, a collective of writers, artists, and intellectuals, became an influential force in the cultural life of London during the interwar period. The group, which included Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, and Lytton Strachey, contributed to the development of modernist thought and literary experimentation. London was also home to the rise of the film industry, with the West End becoming a popular center for cinema and theater productions. The 1920s and 1930s also saw the growth of new forms of mass entertainment, as the radio became an integral part of daily life. Radio broadcasts, particularly those from the BBC, brought news, music, and entertainment into homes across London and the country. The radio became a powerful medium for shaping public opinion and disseminating information, and it played a significant role in the development of popular culture during the interwar years. While London was a center of culture and progress, it was also a city plagued by social inequality and unrest. The economic difficulties of the post-war period left many working-class areas of London mired in poverty. The 1930s, in particular, saw a rise in political unrest as the economic situation worsened. Strikes, protests, and riots became more common as workers and the unemployed fought for better living conditions and fair wages. One of the most significant events of this period was the 1936 Battle of Cable Street, when thousands of anti-fascist protesters clashed with the police to prevent a march by the British Union of Fascists in the East End of London. This event symbolized the growing opposition to fascism and the rise of far-right movements in the city. The years leading up to World War II were marked by increasing tensions in Europe, and London, as the capital of a nation facing the threat of war, began to prepare for the possibility of conflict. The rise of Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany and the subsequent outbreak of war in 1939 set the stage for the next chapter in London's history. While the interwar period was a time of great social change and cultural flourishing, it was also a time of profound economic hardship, political tension, and uncertainty. London's experience during this period laid the groundwork for the challenges and transformations that would come with World War II and its aftermath. World War II had a profound and transformative impact on London, marking a period of intense hardship, resilience, and reconstruction. The city, as the heart of Britain's war effort, endured devastating attacks, widespread destruction, and immense social and economic strain. However, in the aftermath of the war, London's role as a global city was redefined. The immediate post-war years saw the city begin to rebuild physically, socially, and economically, and this era laid the foundation for the modern London that emerged in the latter half of the 20th century. The outbreak of World War II in 1939 had an immediate impact on London. As the capital of Britain, the city was a prime target for the enemy, and it became the focal point of the German Blitz, a sustained bombing campaign that targeted London and other cities across the United Kingdom. The Blitz, which lasted from September 1940 to May 1941, resulted in widespread destruction, with key landmarks, residential areas, and industrial sites being heavily bombed. The iconic areas of the city, such as the heart of the City of London, Buckingham Palace, and the Houses of Parliament, were bombed in air raids, causing immense damage and loss of life. The London skyline was forever altered as historical buildings, homes, and businesses were reduced to rubble. During the Blitz, more than 30,000 civilians in London lost their lives, and hundreds of thousands were injured. Despite the devastation, Londoners displayed remarkable resilience. The people of London endured the air raids with courage and determination, and many continued to go about their daily lives in the face of destruction. The city's underground railway system became a makeshift shelter for many, offering refuge from the bombs. The British government, under Winston Churchill's leadership, rallied the nation and fostered a spirit of unity and defiance, encapsulated in the famous speeches of Churchill, such as his call to never surrender. The bombings also had a significant psychological impact on London's population. Many families were forced to evacuate the city, seeking safety in the countryside or in other regions of the country. The destruction and the constant threat of more bombings created a sense of fear and instability, but it also brought the community closer together, with neighbors banding together to provide mutual aid and support. The British government implemented the Dig for Victory campaign, encouraging citizens to grow their own food to help mitigate food shortages caused by the war. These efforts helped foster a sense of collective responsibility and national pride during this difficult period. As the war progressed, London became a hub for wartime industry and military strategy. The government's efforts to produce war materials led to the establishment of factories and munitions plants, which employed large numbers of workers, including women. The war also prompted advancements in technology and infrastructure, such as the development of radar systems and new forms of military equipment. The strategic importance of London was undeniable, and it was at the center of the war effort, with various branches of the military coordinating operations from the city. The end of World War II in 1945 brought an end to the bombing raids, but London was left to deal with the aftermath of years of destruction. The city was in a state of disrepair, with many buildings and neighborhoods requiring extensive rebuilding. In addition to the physical destruction, the post-war years were marked by severe economic challenges. Britain's wartime debt was enormous, and the country was economically weakened by the years of conflict. The post-war austerity period saw widespread rationing, fuel shortages, and a general sense of deprivation, as the country worked to rebuild both its economy and its infrastructure. Despite these challenges, the immediate post-war years also saw significant progress in rebuilding London. The Labour government elected in 1945 under Prime Minister Clement Attlee embarked on an ambitious program of social reform and reconstruction. The government introduced policies aimed at improving housing, healthcare, and education. One of the most significant achievements of this era was the creation of the National Health Service, NHS, in 1948, which provided free healthcare to all British citizens, including those in London. This was a monumental shift in social policy and marked the beginning of the British welfare state. Housing became one of the most pressing issues in post-war London. The war had left large parts of the city in ruins, and the housing shortage was a serious concern. The government initiated large-scale rebuilding projects, and new housing estates were constructed in the city's suburbs. The government also promoted the building of prefabricated homes as a temporary solution to provide shelter for those displaced by the bombings. While these efforts provided much-needed accommodation, the housing crisis persisted for several years, and many working-class families still lived in inadequate conditions. The post-war period also saw the rise of the Windrush generation, a term used to describe Caribbean immigrants who arrived in Britain between 1948 and 1971, many of whom settled in London. The arrival of these immigrants was a direct result of the British government's call for workers to help rebuild the country after the war. The Windrush generation played an essential role in London's recovery and contributed to the city's cultural diversity. Over the following decades, London became home to a growing number of immigrants from former British colonies, which would help shape the city's identity as a global melting pot of cultures, languages, and traditions. London's cultural landscape also underwent significant transformation in the immediate post-war years. The war had disrupted many of the city's cultural institutions, but the 1940s and 1950s saw a resurgence in arts, theater, and entertainment. The West End theaters reopened and began staging popular productions once again, and London became a center for global culture. The city's music scene, too, began to thrive with the rise of British jazz and the beginnings of the British rock and roll movement. The BBC continued to play a pivotal role in shaping British culture, with radio broadcasts offering entertainment and information to millions of listeners. Economically, London's role as a financial capital began to be re-established in the post-war period, despite the challenges posed by austerity measures and the need for reconstruction. The City of London, which had been severely affected by the war, slowly began to recover and retain its position as a global financial hub. The Bank of England, London Stock Exchange, and major financial institutions played a crucial role in the rebuilding of the British economy in the years following the war. The social landscape of London also began to change during the post-war period. The baby boom that followed World War II led to a significant increase in population, and the demand for goods and services surged. This period also saw the beginning of the decline of London's traditional industries and the rise of the service sector. The city's economy was increasingly based on finance, tourism, and cultural industries, while manufacturing and heavy industry began to shift to other parts of the country or abroad. Throughout the 1950s, London continued to face challenges, including ongoing housing shortages, economic difficulties, and the gradual erosion of its once dominant position in the British Empire. Nevertheless, the city emerged from the war as a resilient and modern metropolis, with a new social order and a renewed commitment to rebuilding and reform. London's identity as a global center of culture, commerce, and diversity was solidified in the post-war period, setting the stage for the vibrant, dynamic city it would become in the decades that followed. In conclusion, the years during and immediately after World War II marked a pivotal chapter in the history of London. While the city suffered greatly during the war and faced immense challenges in the post-war period, it also emerged stronger and more united. The physical reconstruction of London, the social reforms that were introduced, and the influx of immigrants contributed to the city's growth and transformation. London, once a city devastated by war, became a symbol of resilience, progress, and cultural diversity in the years that followed.